All right, so we're diving into the Palo Alto City Council meetings from March 18th and the 25th. Got the minutes here from a regular meeting and a special one. So I guess that means we're catching the council dealing with, you know, the usual stuff, but also maybe some of those like hot button topics that can really get people fired up, right?
Yeah, it's fascinating, actually. When you dig into these meetings, you really see the sheer variety of things the city council is responsible for. I mean, it goes way beyond just like fixing potholes or whatever. We're talking about decisions that really shape the character of the entire community.
Hold on, shape the character of the community. That seems kind of heavy for a meeting about like permits and budgets, doesn't it? What issues are we talking about here?
Well, you've got your typical stuff. Development projects, budgets, those sorts of things. But then you get into some really interesting territory. Like, there were public comments about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this big debate about how to manage San Antonio Road pedestrians, people living in their vehicles. They even got into the environmental impact of cremation.
Cremation. Okay, you've got my attention. What happened there?
So during public comment, there was this resident, Liz G. She spoke at both meetings, actually. And she was talking about feeling silenced, like she was being, labeled or something, just for sharing her opinions on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Wow.
It's a good reminder that local politics isn't always just about, bike lanes and zoning changes. These things can get really personal, touch on global issues. And those issues, they resonate within a community just like anywhere else.
Yeah, for sure. It makes you think like what other national or even international issues are kind of playing out in these local debates, you know?
Absolutely. And then there's the San Antonio Road Corridor study. The council was looking at findings from Cal Poly, and it turned into this whole debate about how to make the area safer for pedestrians, but also how to address the needs of people who are living in their vehicles.
Man, that's a tough one.
It is. It's like a microcosm of what cities all over the U.S. are struggling with right now.
Yeah.
How do you balance these competing interests, especially when we're talking about essential resources like public space?
Right, right. It's like trying to solve one of those equations where every decision you make, it has all these ripple effects, impacts different groups in different ways.
Exactly. And it shows how crucial it is for city councils to be thinking long-term, not just about the immediate needs, but the lasting impact of their decisions.
Okay, so speaking of like residents making their needs known, did you see what was happening with Living Wisdom High School? They had a bunch of people speaking up for them.
Oh, yeah. Living Wisdom, they're pushing for more space at Coverly Community Center. And there was a lot of support from parents, students, even mental health professionals.
Interesting.
They were making the argument that the school's approach to education,
Mm.
which really emphasizes emotional well-being along with academics, they were saying that's more important now than ever.
Which, given everything happening with like youth mental health these days,
Exactly.
I can see why they'd make that case. So, did the council seem sympathetic to their request?
Well, they definitely acknowledge that the need for youth mental health resources, and they see the value in what Living Wisdom is doing. But space at Coverly, that's a hot commodity. So
So it's complicated.
always
Yeesh.
this whole debate about school resources,
Mm.
it ties into a much bigger conversation about education, about equity, about access. It's something happening all over the country. How do we make sure all students have access to quality education? And how do we do that regardless of where they live or their background?
It's a huge question. And definitely no easy answers. Speaking of tough questions, I got to ask about the elephant in the room, council member compensation. Anything interesting come up about their pay?
Oh, absolutely. This is where things get interesting. The council had this whole debate about whether to keep the stipend system they have, or if they should switch to making council positions full-time salaried roles.
Okay, so before we jump to conclusions about them, trying to pad their own pockets or whatever.
Right.
This is about more than just money, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It gets at the very nature of public service. Who are we electing to represent us? And how do we make sure those people can actually dedicate themselves to the job?
You hit it right on the head. The compensation debate, it's really about representation and about priorities, too. If the pay isn't enough, are we only going to attract people who are already well off? Are we creating a system where only the wealthy can afford to serve? It's a question a lot of cities are grappling with, and it sounds like Palo Alto is no different. So how did the council want to approach this whole compensation thing?
Well, they decided to form a citizens advisory committee to, look into it further. But even that caused some debate.
Oh, I bet. It's Palo Alto, right. Can't have a committee without a good old-fashioned debate about the committee itself.
Exactly. Some council members, they wanted a small group, people with experience, like former council members.
Yeah.
Folks who could hit the ground running and give informed recommendations.
Makes
But then others were pushing for a larger group, something more diverse, more representative of the whole community.
Yeah. It's that classic tension, right, between wanting expertise,
Mm-hmm.
but also making sure the people making the decisions actually reflect the community they serve,
Right, exactly.
which I think is a good reminder for us, too. This
Mhm.
whole thing about civic engagement, how do we get more people involved? And I don't just mean voting, but actually participating in these decisions.
That's so important.
And it makes what we find in these meeting minutes even more interesting, I think. Speaking of which, you mentioned earlier the Pets in Need contract renewal. That seemed to stir up some feelings. What was going on there?
Yeah, so Pets in Need, they're the ones who run the city's animal shelter. And it seems like they've been getting some criticism lately. During public comment, a lot of residents expressed concerns about how the organization is being run and about transparency or the lack thereof.
Interesting. Transparency is definitely key with any kind of public service, I think. Especially when you're talking about animals, who can't exactly advocate for themselves.
Absolutely.
And it gets into this bigger issue of accountability, right? When you've got a third-party organization running these essential city services, how do you make sure they're actually meeting the community's needs and that they're being held to the same standards as a city-run operation would be?
It's a tough balance. Trying to weigh the potential cost savings of outsourcing against the need for oversight and control.
So did anyone offer any specific solutions? Or was it mostly just expressing concerns?
Some people actually suggested that the city should think about bringing animal services back in-house.
Wow, okay.
Now, whether that's actually feasible, who knows? But it shows how strongly some people feel about this issue.
Right. It seems like almost every item on the agenda, it just opens up this whole other can of worms. Makes you realize how complex it is to run a city.
It really does.
So beyond just reacting to these immediate problems, did the council talk about any bigger priorities for the year ahead?
They did, and it's actually pretty revealing. Gives you some insight into what they value and what they see as the most important challenges facing Palo Alto right now.
Okay, so what were those big picture items?
Well, housing came up a lot, unsurprisingly.
Of course. It wouldn't be a Bay Area City Council meeting without the housing conversation.
Right. And they weren't just paying lip service to it either. They talked about the need for more affordable housing. And they discussed different strategies, like using city-owned land for affordable housing projects, exploring new ways to fund these projects. And they even talked about maybe streamlining the approval process to make it easier to actually get these developments built.
It's good to hear they're at least talking about concrete steps. Because it can feel sometimes like it's all just talk.
I know what you mean.
So beside housing, what else was on their radar?
Well, climate change and sustainability were also high on the list of priorities.
Not surprising. Palo Alto likes to be at the forefront of all that, right?
Right.
So what kind of measures are they looking at?
Expanding EV infrastructure, investing in renewable energy,
Sure.
and continuing their work on pedestrian and bicycle safety. They even talked about those smart meters they've been promising forever.
Oh, the smart meters. Are those finally going to happen, or are they just going to stay in the coming soon phase of Palo Alto urban legend?
It seems like they're actually happening now, like installations are underway across the city.
Well, let's hope it goes smoother than some of their other recent projects, huh?
We can only hope.
But seriously, though, this focus on electric vehicles, renewable energy, walkable neighborhoods, it all paints a picture of what kind of future the council is imagining for Palo Alto.
A future where sustainability and, just being a good place to live, those are top priorities.
And they're paying attention to the smaller details, too, right? Like we talked about the youth mental health concerns.
Exactly. That came up again.
Along with stuff like safe routes to schools, community wellness programs.
They discussed Caltrain safety improvements, too.
It's all connected in a way.
It is.
They're trying to create a community where everyone feels safe, supported, no matter how they get around or what their background is. It's ambitious, for sure. But are these just empty promises?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? It's tough to tell sometimes, right? Just from reading the minutes, they're just a snapshot, like a glimpse of this one moment in time.
Yeah, you don't always see the whole picture, do you?
Exactly. Like what's happening behind the scenes, the compromises, the different priorities everyone has, all those pressures that actually shape the final decision.
It's like when you read the first few pages of a book. You might have some ideas about how it ends, but you don't really know yet, do you? And that's where you come in, right? As someone who lives here, who cares about Palo Alto? Because it's not just up to the city council to decide what happens, is it?
Not at all.
So how do we actually bridge that gap then? Between what gets talked about in those meetings and what actually gets done? How do we make sure our voices are heard, that it's not just like showing up for public comment?
It's a good question. And honestly, there's no easy answer. But I think it starts with staying informed. Reading these minutes, listening to this deep dive. That's a good first step, but it can't be the only one.
Right. What else can we do?
Go to a city council meeting. Reach out to your council member, get to know them, get involved with community groups that share your values.
It's all about being engaged citizens.
Yep. Exactly. The more you understand the nuances of these issues, who the stakeholders are, how decisions are made, the better equipped you'll be to advocate for the things you care about.
Knowledge is power, as they say.
It's true.
So, there you have it. Consider this your crash course in Palo Alto City Council 101.
There you go.
We've gone through the meeting minutes, pulled out the key takeaways, and hopefully got you thinking a little bit more about what's going on in your own backyard.
Exactly.
But now it's your turn. Take what you've learned here and put it into action.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
These issues we've been talking about, housing, education, climate change, representation, they're not easy to solve, that's for sure.
Definitely not.
But if we stay informed, if we're willing to have those tough conversations, and if we work together, we can create a Palo Alto that reflects what we value as a community.
Well said.
Until next time, Palo Alto. Stay curious, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay involved.